Welcome to this video I made about building an oval dining room table for a client. So this table is all made from hard maple from Vermont. The first thing I like to do when I have the wood back in the workshop is to mark it all the size and get ready to mill it to the correct dimensions. The first step to milling the lumber is to cut it to a rough length on the miter saw here. So all the boards are rough sawn on the edge, which means we have to use the jointer to create a flat, straight edge. And that basically is just running it over a spinning blade onto this fence. And once that's done, the edges of the boards should be completely straight and ready to be milled further. The next step is to mark where I want to drill the holes for the dowels. I like to use dowels when I glue up panels this size to help with the alignment. They don't actually add strength to the tabletop per se, but they really make it easier when you're clamping it together to have something to make sure the boards fit together the right way. So this is a dowel jig, which basically makes sure the hole is right in the middle of the board, so that when you glue the two boards together, they're going to be completely flat. Okay, so now it's time to glue together the first half of the table. So basically I'm just putting the dowels in and gluing each board to the next. And I like to do one half at a time because it's a lot simpler and I can ensure that all the joints are very well together. And then we'll put the two halves together after this.
Gluing's always a little stressful because once you start, you kind of have to get it right. You can't really stop it, pretty much. But this came together really well.
So gluing together the two halves of the table can be a bit tricky, but I basically use every single clamp and strap and just take my time. And this tabletop worked out really well, and I'm happy with how they came together. Once the tabletop is curing, it's time to mill the lumber for the legs, which is the same steps as I used for the top. You first joint it to create a straight edge. Then you want to cut it to the right width, which in this case is about 2 3/4 inches. And then you want to cut it to length here, and this is also a rough length. We're going to cut it to the final length once they're all glued up.
Okay, so we have all the leg pieces milled up here. They look like this. And basically we're going to glue all of them together. So 3 pieces per leg, 12 pieces. And that's okay because when you clamp something like this, the clamping pressure actually goes all the way through like that. So you could glue as many legs together as you want in one go.
So here's all the legs that are now glued up, and we're going to mill them down to the correct dimensions after, but I just want to make sure that they're clamped together really well and the contact is good. All this glue squeezed out is a very good sign. So the first thing I like to do with the tabletop is use a hand plane here. It's a bit of hard work, but it's the best tool to remove all the high spots and any bits of glue that are still on the tabletop. After I do that, I use the circular saw to cut it to a rough size, and then I'm going to flip the table over. So now I'm marking the underside of the table after I flipped it over with this pencil, and I'm just marking the actual finished dimensions, and then I'm going to cut it to this rough size using the jigsaw. The jigsaw is not very precise, so I stay maybe a quarter or an eighth of an inch away from my line, and then I'm going to cut it to its final dimensions using the router. So this is the jig to cut the ends of the table into a half circle, and it's just a piece of plywood that I've fastened the router to and a screw. The screw is in the middle of the table, and it will just move and cut a perfect half circle. So it's important with this to do lots of small passes so that the router doesn't have to work too hard and cause any extra chip out or anything like that. And I basically just do this for each end, and that creates the perfect half circle shape. To cut the edges down to size, we're using a flush trim bit and a straight edge here. And we'll do several passes again to make sure it stays nice and smooth. Alright, so that is all routered around the edges here. As you can see, we have something that looks like a tabletop now. Next step is to mill the lumber for the underside of the table. I'm going to be gluing it all around the edges of the table to give a thicker profile to the edge, basically. All the little pieces had to be glued individually, and I could only glue several at a time. And in between each, I'd like to clean it up with a chisel. It was quite a lengthy process to attach all of these pieces because they all had to line up with the grain of the table, so there was tons and tons of little pieces being glued onto the bottom. Once I had all the pieces glued in, I cut them down again with the flush trim router bit just to match the tabletop. Now it's time to build the leg assembly, so this starts with milling the legs down to their final size. This is a familiar process now, so we use the jointer and then the table saw to cut it to the correct dimensions, and then we cut it with the miter saw to the correct length. Then I glued and screwed the wood for the skirt together. This is the framework from which I'll fasten the legs to so they can't move around and stay nice and sturdy. And now the parts are all finished, the leg assembly and the tabletop, and it's time to sand it all. There's lots and lots of sanding on a job like this. I start with the orbital sander at 120 grit. This is to remove any of the bigger marks, any bits of glue or anything else on the surface. Lots of sanding. When I'm done with the orbital sander, I move to the palm sander and 150 grit sandpaper, and then the palm sander with 180 grit sandpaper. After I'm done that, I like to sand it by hand, and this includes smoothing over any of the sharp edges of the table and just making sure everything feels really good. The finish I'm using for this is Rubio Monocoat Cotton White. So this is a really nice finish I love to use. It's a 2-part oil and hardener, and basically it bonds to the wood, so it's very, very strong and durable. The application is quite simple. You have to spread it over the entire surface you're working on, and then you wipe it up. And once it's dry to the touch, it's ready to cure. The last thing on the table build is to attach the leg assembly to the tabletop, which I'm just doing here using some small metal brackets. And it's done. I'm really happy with how the maple turned out with the cotton white finish here. I think it's one of the nicer tables I've built, and I'll post some more videos of some other stuff coming up. Thank you so much for watching.